JavaScript is not only the most popular programming language in the world, it's one of the most badly written. And because of its history, there's a lot of bad JavaScript out there on the web. And there are several things you're likely to see when reading JavaScript that I specifically chose not to include in this course. And at this point, I'm going to tell you a few of them so you can recognize them and make your own choice about whether to look deeper at them or not. And the first one is document.write. This is very commonly seen in early JavaScript tutorials. It lets you write a string directly to the current page. And as you can see from this example, you can even include HTML tags inside it. Let me show you a basic example here. So I've got a very straightforward HTML page, and instead of making a separate JavaScript file, I've just got two document.write calls inside a script tag here. If I run this page, I'll see that this is outputting some text directly into the body of the page, whereas the previous text here is just here inside a h1 and a paragraph tag. That doesn't look so bad. But there's a few issues with this. See, document.write doesn't work in XHTML. It doesn't understand the DOM properly, and it just spits out stuff wherever it's placed. It's a clunky, inflexible way of doing anything with a page. And the most substantial reason that you don't want to get used to it is because you can only use it when the page is initially loading. If, for example, I decide to have a function and put document.write inside that function, and then I'm going to just call that function a couple of seconds after the page has loaded. Let's see what happens. So I save that, I flip over to Firefox where we have it, I refresh this page, and 2 seconds later, the document.write destroys the original page because it will only work as the page is being created for the first time. Run it anytime after the page is loaded, it will erase the contents of the document. So much better to use inner HTML, or better still, to work with creating and manipulating the individual DOM elements and text nodes. Next up is if you ever see code that looks something like this. Browser sniffing code. You're reading something that seems to be detecting Netscape or Microsoft Internet Explorer or a particular platform. This is really old school stuff. Browser sniffing, it used to be necessary, but it hasn't been for several years, and it's usually a dead giveaway that what you're looking at is very old code, or it's written by someone who hasn't brushed up their JavaScript skills in way too long. Any code that seems to be detecting an actual browser or an actual platform should be looked on with great skepticism. While there might be a very occasional edge case where you want to do something with a particular browser, in general, any detection we should do is detecting features, not browsers. And that's much simpler than working with the navigator.userAgent properties. Next up is the eval function. Eval is a powerful little function that can take an expression and execute it as code. That sounds a little weird, so let me show you what I mean. Let's say I create a variable a that's a string, and it contains kind of half a statement here. And variable b contains hello, and variable c contains a closing single quote and closing parentheses. What we can actually do is use eval, and then we could combine those three variables together into one long string. And if I pass it to the eval function, eval will actually cause that to be executed as if it was code. Now the issue is there are almost always better ways to do it than eval. This is really ugly. It's hard to figure out what's going on. It's inefficient. It can lead to security problems because you're executing code that's stored in variables. And if you're reading one of those variables from the outside world, say the contents of a form field, it can effectively inject code you didn't write into your JavaScript. It's generally agreed upon that eval is a bad thing, so you might see it, but don't do it. And the fourth thing I wanted to mention is what's called a pseudo protocol. This is very common to see inside HTML. It's a way of making a link or a button directly call a function. So in a regular HTML anchor tag, instead of having an href equal to the address of a web page using HTTP, we have JavaScript colon and then say the name of a function. This is called a pseudo protocol because usually what you'd be doing here is linking to HTTP colon or HTTPS colon, and those are real internet protocols. JavaScript colon is not. It's just a way of telling the browser to call a JavaScript function here instead of going to an actual address. Okay, looks pretty easy, but what's the problem? Well, one, you're mixing your HTML with your script, not a good thing in principle. And two, if JavaScript is disabled, this is useless. You have a link that does nothing. Now, there's a similar format that's slightly better, where you use the name of the event. So in this case, I do actually have an href here that's pointing to an actual page, to an actual address. And then I have onClick equals, in this case, some function, colon, return false. This is preferable to the pseudo protocol. Here, at least, I've treated this link as the link it's meant to be with a real address, and I've added the onClick handler as a separate attribute. Now, what you often see here is the statement return false, and this is here to stop the default behavior of this link, which would be to follow the actual link here. So in this case, if JavaScript is enabled, we will run the JavaScript function called someFunction, and if not, we would call the JavaScript HTML link and follow that link. But I'm not a big fan of this method either, and I much prefer leaving my HTML as pure content as possible and adding event handlers directly inside my code, which is why all along in this course, we've attempted to use JavaScript that when it runs adds functionality to an existing page that already works. And it's again, this is the concept of progressive enhancement.